You stand in the great hall, and the first thing you notice is not the gold, not the jewels, not the towering tapestries, but the air. It is thick, damp, almost tangible, and it clings to the inside of your throat when you breathe. The scent is layered: smoke from torches, the sour tang of unwashed bodies, the sharp bite of urine soaked into the rushes under your feet. Somewhere beneath it all is a sweetness, faint and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. Your boots sink into the floor covering, not soft, but matted rushes laid down months ago, now crushed flat by countless feet and crawling with unseen life. When you shift your weight, you feel the brittle crack of insect shells breaking under your heel. A draft snakes through the hall, carrying whispers and the dull hum of flies that never seem to rest. At the far end of the chamber, on a dais carved with saints and vines, she sits, the queen. From a distance, she is everything the poets promised, gowned in rich brocade, her crown scattering light in a halo of gold. Jewels drip from her wrists, her throat, her hair. She looks as if she were carved for eternity. But eternity smells. The closer you draw, the more the illusion frays. Her face, powdered pale, is cracked at the edges where the lead has dried. A faint sheen of sweat beads beneath it, mixing with perfume so thick it seems to wrap itself around you. In the shadows of her eyes, you see exhaustion, and at her temple, the slow twitch of fingers reaching to scratch an itch. You watch the faint, deliberate way she keeps her arms still, how she tilts her head to keep the jeweled hood from slipping, because movement might disturb the things hidden in her clothing. And when she speaks, her words glide forward on breath that carries the unmistakable staleness of a mouth long untouched by clean water or brush. The paintings lied. The songs lied.
The letters lied.
They showed you silk and satin, not the crawling beneath. They told you of purity and grace, not the lice comb tucked into her coffer or the stains hidden in her underclothes. And you have not yet heard the worst of it. One queen, the records whisper, wore the same linen shift for over a year. Slept in it, walked in it, prayed in it without ever washing it once. You think skipping one shower is bad? Try a lifetime. By the end of this story, every royal portrait you've ever seen will look different. You'll see the gold. You'll see the power. But you'll smell the truth. The smile of a medieval queen was not the pearly curve the portrait suggested. Behind her lips lay the slow ruin of a lifetime's diet. Honeyed wine that clung to the teeth, sweetmeats steeped in syrup, preserved fruits soaked in sugar, and meats cured so heavily with salt they left the mouth parched for hours. Each bite, each sip, fed not only her hunger but the decay within. Chroniclers wrote of breath so foul it seemed to seep from the grave itself, a stench that lingered in the air long after the speaker had gone. When her lips parted to speak, the words carried the weight of rot, sickly, warm, and unmistakable. There were no bristled brushes, no rinses to scour the mouth clean. At best, a scrap of linen might be rubbed along the teeth, or a pinch of coarse salt ground across the gums. More often, nothing at all was done. The film of food and drink was left to fester, building layer upon layer until the gums swelled and the teeth blackened. And yet, blackness became a mark of wealth. To rot in this way was to show that you could afford sugar in quantities so great it consumed you from the inside out. It was a decay reserved for the powerful, a privilege of slow destruction. If you can handle this truth while others turn away, then you're exactly who Echoes of Time is for. Subscribe now before history is whitewashed again. In the chambers beyond the throne room, behind bolted doors and heavy curtains, another truth of queenship unfolded. One spoken of rarely, and never in public. When her bleeding days came, she was bound by rules older than her crown. Bathing was forbidden, for the physicians of her age warned that water, touching a body with open pores, would invite sickness that could take her life. The warmth of the bath was seen not as comfort, but as danger, a gateway for disease to slip inside. So she endured, unwashed, as the days passed. Her linens, crude squares of cloth, nothing like the fine silks that touched her skin at court, were used again and again. They were rinsed not in clean water, but in stale urine, thought to cleanse and disinfect. The acrid smell clung to them, sharp and inescapable, even when dry. When they could no longer be worn without falling apart, they were tucked away in wooden chests, hidden from view but not from memory. The blood itself was a thing to be concealed at all costs. Stains seeped into the shift she wore beneath her gown, concealed by layers of fabric and embroidery, so that no courtier could guess what flowed beneath. She moved slowly, carefully, the weight of each step reminding her of the secret she carried. A secret shared by every queen before her, and everyone to follow. Most people would rather pretend this never happened. If you're still listening, prove you're not most people. Subscribe and join the few who refuse to forget. Cleanliness, in the world of medieval queens, was not measured by the absence of vermin, only by how well one could endure them. From the moment she was married, a queen's dowry was not only gold, gowns, and jewels. Hidden among the treasures was another object, small and unremarkable to the eye. A fine-toothed comb, carved from ivory or bone. Its purpose was not vanity. It was for lice. Even a queen's hair, perfumed and braided beneath a crown, was a home to them. The comb was a silent acknowledgement that no rank could keep the crawling away. Her bed, carved from oak and draped in embroidered hangings, offered no refuge. In the seams of the mattress, in the folds of the velvet canopy, fleas bred and fed. When she lay down to sleep, she felt them at her ankles, her wrists, her scalp. The warmth of her body drew them out, their bites leaving red constellations across her skin. The fur-lined cloaks that kept her warm in winter were no safer. The lining, once soft, became a living nest for insects. Even her crown, heavy with gemstones, could shelter small, unseen bodies in its padded rim. At court, she could feel them moving, a tickle against her temple as she smiled before the crowd. In some courts, small dogs were kept not for companionship alone, but for pest control. Nestled in the queen's lap, their warmth lured fleas from her clothing onto their fur, where they could be picked away. It was an unspoken service, performed daily, in full view of courtiers who pretended not to see. And the evidence endures. In the garments and shrouds taken from royal tombs, centuries later, the remains of vermin still cling. Eggs, shells, and fragments of bodies, locked in the threads as if waiting for the warmth of life to wake them again. Beauty, in the courts of medieval queens, was a performance measured not by health, but by how convincingly one could disguise decay. The pale, flawless skin you see in portraits was not a gift of nature. It was crafted each morning from powders ground fine as dust, pressed into the skin until it clung like a mask. The most prized of these powders came from lead, white, opaque, and deadly. Layer after layer, it smoothed away blemishes while quietly poisoning the flesh beneath. Over time, it thinned the skin, opened sores, and etched cracks into the very face it was meant to perfect. For those seeking an even brighter pallor, there was mercury, distilled into creams and waters that promised youth but seeped slowly into the blood. The touch of it brought tremors, memory loss, and madness, but beauty was worth the cost. The recipes for these cosmetics were strange collections of the world's refuse. Pigeon droppings crushed and mixed with vinegar to bleach the skin, ash from burnt herbs combined with honey to stain the lips, animal fat boiled down to smooth the hands. Each concoction carried its own risks, but the danger was hidden beneath silk gloves and painted smiles. Perfume was no delicate luxury here, it was necessity. Not a whisper of scent meant to charm, but a dense, cloying cloud meant to smother the odors of sweat, rotting teeth, and unwashed fabric. In the crowded air of the throne room, it became another layer in the mix of smells, sweet and suffocating. And sometimes beauty killed outright. Court letters record the sudden illness of noblewomen whose powders were tainted, whose face paints carried enough poison to stop the heart. These deaths were spoken of in whispers, the cause never named aloud, but the truth lingered in the powder jars left behind. If you're hearing ingredients no history class dared to mention, it's because most people can't handle them. Are you one of the few who can? Subscribe to Echoes of Time. In the silence of a royal birthing chamber, the air was thick with heat and breath. Curtains were drawn tight to keep the warmth in, trapping every sound, every smell. The queen lay on her side or propped against pillows, the weight of the child pressing downward with each contraction. Around her, women moved in close, noble ladies, attendants, and the midwife who would guide the birth. There was no ritual of washing hands, no boiling of cloths or cleansing of tools. The midwife's fingers, already busy from earlier duties, touched the queen as they were, carrying with them the unseen life that would become her greatest danger. The linens beneath her were precious, but not fresh. Many had been used before, stained by other births, rinsed in cold water, dried, and folded away until needed again. The scent of them mingled with the smell of sweat, blood, and candle smoke, settling over the room like a shroud. If the birth was swift and the child cried, relief swept the chamber. But it was never the end. In the hours or days that followed, the queen might begin to burn with fever. Her skin would flush, her pulse race, her breath grow shallow. This was puerperal fever, blood poisoning that claimed mothers without mercy. It was so common it was expected, its cause unknown, its cure out of reach. Queens who had survived wars, sieges, and political intrigue could be gone within 3 days of giving life. Their bodies, once paraded as symbols of dynastic strength, were prepared for burial before the newborn had taken its first steps. The mourning was brief. For a king, the queen's death was a wound to be covered quickly. A new bride would be sought, not for love, but for heirs. And so the cycle began again, each marriage carrying the shadow of the last. The gowns of a medieval queen were masterpieces of craft. Yards of brocade, velvet, and silk stitched with threads of gold. They dazzled the eye, but they were never meant to touch water. Once sewn, they would never see a wash basin. The weight of their fabrics, the fragility of their dyes, and the superstition that laundering would ruin them meant that dirt, sweat, and the oils of the body sank deeper with every wear. When they grew soiled, they were brushed, beaten, and perfumed. Servants would hang them in open air to let the wind carry away the worst of the smell. But the stench lingered. Beneath the perfume, the sourness of old sweat and the faint bite of mildew told the truth. Those gowns that were retired to chests or storerooms did not rest untouched. In the darkness, worms crept into the seams, gnawing at the fabric until only a fragile shell of embroidery remained. Opening such a chest years later was to release the faint dust of decay. The corsets and bodices worn beneath the gowns were worse still. Bound tightly around the torso, they trapped heat, sweat, and the crawling of lice against the skin. Weeks could pass without the garment being removed, the layers beneath never washed. The queen's body became its own prison, sealed in cloth. In rare but whispered cases, the very clothing became a weapon. There are tales of poisoned gowns, fabrics treated with deadly substances that would seep into the skin over hours, killing the wearer without blade or wound. Whether all were true or not, the fear was enough to make some queens refuse gifts of clothing from unfriendly hands. Most viewers will click away here, not because it's too long, but because the truth is too heavy. Prove you're not them. Subscribe and carry this history forward. The grandeur of a medieval palace ended where the nose began. Behind the carved stone facades and gilded chambers, the air was thick with a stench that could not be disguised. Waste from the upper floors was tipped directly into the courtyards below, where it pooled in stagnant corners or trickled into the streets. On warm days, the smell rose like a living thing, clinging to every wall, every tapestry, every breath. Inside, the floors were strewn with rush mats meant to soften the tread and trap the chill of stone. But they trapped more than cold. Layer upon layer of rushes absorbed the urine of dogs, the droppings of palace cats, the spillage of overturned wine, and the filth of human feet. In time, they became blackened and damp, their sweet scent of meadow grass replaced by rot. Even in the presence of the queen, dignity bowed to necessity. Guests, unwilling to leave an audience, would slip behind heavy curtains or alcoves and relieve themselves there, the act hidden but the evidence impossible to ignore. The stench would drift back into the chamber, carried on the same air that bore the murmur of courtly conversation. Perfume fountains, placed strategically in halls and reception rooms, were tasked with covering the odor. They gurgled with scented waters, spilling fragrance into the air, but the sweetness mingled with the underlying filth to create something worse. A cloying, heavy perfume that masked nothing and lingered long after the guests had gone. Filth was not always seen as shame. In the minds of the devout, it could be a mark of virtue. There were queens who, in the midst of religious campaigns, swore never to change their clothes until victory was won. What began as a vow of humility became a slow surrender to the body's decay. The same gown, worn for weeks or months, stiffened with sweat and grime, clung to the skin like a shroud. The fabric grew heavy with oils, the scent deepening until it was part of the air she carried with her. On pilgrimage, some refused to bathe entirely, believing that the touch of water would wash away the protection of God. Dust from the road clung to their faces, streaked with salt from the heat of the day. Insects made their homes in the folds of their garments, biting at the skin beneath. The church itself held up examples of holy endurance. Saints were canonized despite, or perhaps because of, their disregard for the body's cleanliness. Lice swarmed over their scalps and sores opened on their skin. Yet their filth was praised as proof of their rejection of vanity. In this world, washing was not a renewal, it was a risk. To scrub away the dirt was to invite sin, to make room for pride, and to loosen the grip of divine favor. And so the dirt was kept, worn as armor against both temptation and the judgment of God. History books may call it holiness, we're calling it what it was. If you agree, subscribe to Echoes of Time and challenge the fairy tale. The day begins in darkness, long before the sun has reached the palace walls. She wakes not to silence, but to the faint rustle of movement beneath the covers. A living stir in the mattress. Fleas scatter as she shifts, leaving small, hot bites in their wake. The air in the chamber is thick, stale from the night, and carries the faint smell of sweat and damp fabric that never dries. Servants bring her gown, its folds rich with embroidery and heavy with pearls. As it is drawn over her shoulders, she feels the familiar crawl against her skin. Lice, burrowed deep into the seams, stirred to life by her body's warmth. The bodice is tightened, trapping the heat, sealing in the insects, the smell, and the dampness from the night before. Before she greets the court, she presses a perfumed cloth to her lips, breathing through the heavy sweetness. It is not meant to charm, it is meant to hide. Beneath the layers of rose oil and musk lies the taste of her own mouth, heavy with decay, the product of years without true cleansing. Her steps carry her down corridors where the rushes underfoot are dark with age, steeped in what they have absorbed over months. Spilled wine, animal droppings, human waste. The smell rises in waves as her shoes press the layers down. At the banquet, the tables glitter with silver and gold, but the meat has sat too long in the warmth of the hall. Fat congeals at the edges, the scent of roasting now edged with the first sourness of rot. Flies gather in the corners, slipping between the folds of banners overhead. She eats, as all do, without remark. When the day's duties end, she returns to her chamber, to the same bed she left that morning. It is already warm, not from the fire, but from the bodies that share it with her, too small to be seen, too many to be counted. The candlelight dims, and the night begins again, the crawl of the unseen keeping time until dawn. Elegance was a performance. The silk, the jewels, the careful tilt of the crown, all a mask for what lay beneath. Behind the curtain, filth was not an accident. It was the constant, the shadow that moved with her from chamber to chamber, day to day, life to death. The image of the queen was painted for the world, but the truth was known only to those who could smell it, touch it, and live inside it. And if you thought the queens of history were bad, wait until you hear about the kings. The men who ruled the same palaces, carried the same habits, and in some ways, surpassed them in their own filth. Their story will stain the image of power even darker. This is Echoes of Time. Subscribe so the truth they buried will not be buried again.